All right, buckle up for this one. Today's deep dive takes us into some seriously provocative territory. We're focusing on the claims of Malcolm Nance,
Oh,
a
yeah.
former intelligence officer who's making some pretty big waves right now with his, let's just say, unique take on Trump and Russia.
Definitely a bold perspective.
He's not holding back. Nance has gone from suggesting that Trump was a witting asset of Russia
Right.
to now straight up declaring him a full-fledged Russian agent, working actively against U.S. interests.
Just a huge jump.
Yeah. So we've got a whole stack of his writings, articles in the Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Atlantic, and a little snippet from the New Yorker newsletter to try and make sense of this.
It's quite the mix.
It is. So how did Nance get here? What evidence does he have to support this pretty explosive accusation? Let's dive in.
Yeah, it's not just that the label he's using has changed, but his reasoning behind it has also evolved. Nance actually points to a TV show proposal that he pitched back in 2017 as a key turning point.
Oh, you mean the one that's basically become reality TV?
Exactly. Talk about unsettling seeing your fictional thriller playing out in the news.
I can't even imagine. So remind me, what was the plot of Nance's fictional show?
So in his story, Russia invades Ukraine, stages a nuclear attack, and then Trump uses this whole chaotic situation to pull the U.S. out of NATO.
And that leaves Europe completely vulnerable.
Totally exposed. And it gets even crazier. He even envisioned Trump arresting his political opponents, rounding them up with help from this, shall we say, patriotic security force.
So a lot of this has actually come true, at least to some extent, thankfully minus the nuclear attack part.
Right, and that's what makes it so eerie. We've got Trump calling for the U.S. to leave NATO, demanding Ukraine surrender territory, and then there are all these allegations of extortion attempts.
At least according to Nance.
Right, according to Nance. And it seems like these recent actions are what really solidified his conviction. He sees them as clear evidence of Trump working against U.S. interests and directly benefiting Russia.
So let's get into the specifics of those actions. We have this article from the Washington Post that dives into the whole financial side of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship.
Okay.
And it points out some pretty big discrepancies between Zelensky's and Trump's claims about the amount of aid that the U.S. has actually given to Ukraine.
Yeah, the numbers are all over the place.
They really are. Zelensky claims Ukraine receives $75 billion directly, while Trump throws out figures closer to $350 billion.
So, big gap.
Yeah, and what's often overlooked is that a lot of this aid doesn't actually go directly to the Ukrainian government.
Right. It's not just a simple transfer of cash.
So where does it all go?
Well, a big chunk of it actually stays within the U.S. It's kind of like this. U.S. taxpayers' money is used to replenish American weapons stockpiles. Those weapons are then sent to Ukraine, which helps boost our domestic manufacturing industry and supports jobs here at home.
So it's more about stimulating the U.S. economy than just helping Ukraine.
Not exactly. There's also humanitarian aid for Ukrainian refugees, which again involves spending within our own borders. It's more complicated than just handing over a lump sum to Ukraine.
So it's not as straightforward as it seems at first glance. There's this whole economic and military element tied into it. And it gets even more interesting when we start looking at the global implications. We have some pretty insightful opinions from Thomas Friedman in the New York Times.
Yeah, he doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't.
Right.
He calls out Trump's disruptive foreign policy approach.
Which, to be fair, isn't always a bad thing.
Right, disruption can sometimes be a good thing. But Friedman's concern is that Trump combines this approach with buying into Putin's narrative, which
Could have some pretty serious consequences.
yeah, like weakening alliances and basically empowering adversaries like Russia
And China.
China, exactly. And Friedman doesn't stop there. He goes on to compare Trump's desires to those of Putin and Xi Jinping, saying they all basically want to be president for life. And he even goes so far as to label the political systems in both Russia and China as low information systems, where truth is suppressed. It's a pretty bold statement.
It is. So he's essentially suggesting that Trump admires these authoritarian leaders and maybe even wants to emulate their methods.
Which brings us to these articles from the Atlantic about the whole power shift happening in the world right now and the dismantling of institutions like USI.
Right, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah. So is this just Trump being a disruptor, as Friedman calls him, or is there something more deliberate going on here, like intentionally dismantling American influence?
Well, the USI situation is particularly interesting. George Packer, the author of one of the Atlantic pieces, argues that this wasn't about saving money or streamlining government. It was about rejecting the very idea of soft power. He says it was a clear signal that the U.S. is no longer prioritizing helping other nations.
So instead of being the world's helper, we're becoming more isolationist.
Well, more like we're moving away from helping the weaker nations and focusing on engaging only with those who hold power.
And doing it on our own terms.
Exactly. And if you're Putin, that probably sounds like music to your ears.
Definitely plays right into his hands.
Yeah.
And this is where Nance's argument about Trump being a Russian agent starts to feel even more, let's say, plausible.
Yeah, I can see how those dots connect. If Trump is really working to benefit Russia at the expense of the U.S., then these actions fit right into that agenda.
So we're starting to see how all these pieces fit together. Trump's actions, Nance's claims, the anxieties of experts like Friedman and Packer. It's all painting a pretty alarming picture, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely a departure from the norms of previous administrations, and the potential consequences are huge. But before we jump to any conclusions, I think we need to look at what other experts are saying and how all of this fits into the bigger picture.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork with Nance's claims, and we've seen how Trump's actions seem to support those claims. But what does this all mean for the world and America's place in it? Well, we'll dive deeper into that in part 2. Welcome back. So we've been unpacking this idea that Trump is actually a Russian agent, actively working to weaken America's global standing and strengthen Russia's.
A pretty bold claim.
Definitely. And one of the most concerning things we talked about was Trump's relentless push to dismantle USAID.
Yeah, and it's not just about shutting down some agency.
Right. It's about what that symbolizes.
Exactly. George Packer, in his article in The Atlantic, he argues that this move, getting rid of USAID, it was a very deliberate rejection of American soft power. That whole idea that America can influence the world, not just through military might, but through things like aid and diplomacy.
So it's not just about, like, saving money or shrinking the government. It's a fundamental shift in how America interacts with the rest of the world.
That's how Packer sees it. And he goes even further. He connects it to a larger pattern he sees in how Trump approaches governing, this kind of systematic dismantling of anything that he sees as unnecessary bureaucracy.
Wow.
Yeah. He even suggests this whole U.S. side thing could be a trial run for dismantling other parts of the federal government.
Like a test case to see how far he can push it.
It's definitely a thought-provoking argument.
So, okay, if we follow Nance's logic, this dismantling of USAID fits right in with the whole idea of intentionally weakening the U.S. on the world stage. And if America steps back from that leadership role, who fills that void?
Well, Russia and China would love to step in.
Of course.
And that's where this other article from The Atlantic, this one by Ann Applebaum, becomes really relevant. She voices some serious concerns about Trump's willingness to align himself with these authoritarian leaders.
Like Putin.
Yeah, like Putin. And she's also worried about his disregard for the sovereignty of America's allies, the countries that we've traditionally been partnered with.
She's basically saying Trump is cozying up to dictators while simultaneously throwing America's allies under the bus.
That's a pretty harsh assessment, but yeah, that's the gist of her argument. And she goes even further, urging European allies to rethink their dependence on the United States. Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I mean, think about it. Europe has relied on U.S. military protection for decades, especially since World War II. If that protection is no longer guaranteed, what happens to their security?
Exactly. That's what's so worrying about all of
Yeah.
this.
And it's a wake-up call for Europe. They might need to start taking their own defense more seriously, building up their militaries, forming new alliances, preparing to stand up to Russia without relying on U.S. support.
Wouldn't that kind of shift just embolden Russia even more? Like
Yeah.
if they sense any weakness or disunity among the Western allies, they're just going to take advantage of it.
Absolutely. That's why these potential consequences are so concerning. It's like a domino effect. What starts with Trump's actions could end up unraveling the entire post-war world order, leading to a way more volatile and dangerous global landscape.
It's scary to think about.
It is. And when you connect this back to Nance's claims, that fictional scenario he wrote where Trump abandons NATO and leaves Europe vulnerable, it suddenly feels a lot less fictional.
Right. It's like, oh, wait a minute, this could actually happen.
It adds this unsettling layer of realism to his theory. And it's not just Nance who's feeling anxious about all this. We've got experts like Friedman warning about the dangers of Trump's foreign policy.
Right. And Packer and Applebaum laying out the potential collapse of the post-war order.
It's like everyone's sounding the alarm.
And yet here we are.
Still in this uncertain territory.
It's interesting. Even the New Yorker newsletter, they briefly mentioned this widespread concern surrounding Trump's foreign policy. It might seem like a small detail, but I think it speaks volumes that even a publication that doesn't typically do deep dives into foreign policy is picking up on this anxiety.
You're right. It shows that these concerns are pretty widespread. People are definitely noticing a shift, and they're not quite sure what it means for the future.
So we've explored these financial ties, the global implications, the potential for this massive shift in the world order. It's a lot to take in, but the question is, what does this mean for the average person? How does this actually impact their lives? Let's explore that in part 3. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into, well, Malcolm Nance's theories. It's been a wild ride, hasn't it?
Definitely a lot to unpack.
We've explored his claim that Trump is a Russian agent, this whole idea that dismantling USAID signals a changing world order, and all the concerns that experts like Friedman, Packer, and Applebaum have about what the future holds.
And it's not a particularly rosy picture they're painting.
Not exactly. But where does all this leave us? Where does it leave the listener?
That's the big question, right? I mean, we've laid out a lot of information, some of it pretty heavy, but it's ultimately up to each person to decide what to make of it.
You're right. We're not here to tell anyone what to think or what to believe. But I think one thing that this whole conversation really highlights is the power of information and sometimes disinformation in shaping how we see the world.
It's impossible to ignore that element.
Nance was talking about this back in 2016, calling Trump the Siberian candidate and highlighting the influence of social media.
And that was years ago. Imagine how much more sophisticated those tactics have become.
Exactly. It's crazy to think about. We're living in a world where it's harder than ever to tell what's true and what's not. We've got algorithms pushing certain narratives, and even sources we think are reliable can be compromised.
So how do we navigate this landscape? How do we make sure we're not being misled?
It feels almost impossible sometimes,
It's definitely a challenge. I think it comes down to being really vigilant and skeptical. Don't just accept things at face value. Don't rely on just one news source or just one social media feed.
Or even just one expert.
Right. Do your own research, challenge your own assumptions, and be open to changing your mind when you come across new evidence.
Friedman talks about this in his article. He calls it stupidity, driven by ignorance and a lack of critical thinking. And he says that kind of thinking can have a real impact on world events.
And he's right. We can't afford to be passive consumers of information. The stakes are way too high. We're talking about democracy, global stability, even the survival of our planet.
No pressure, right?
Yeah, it's a lot. But I think a lot of people listening are probably thinking, okay, so what can I do? Do we just throw up our hands and say it's hopeless?
Not at all. This isn't about despair. It's about awareness. It's a call to action, in a way.
How so?
Well, it's a reminder that we all have a responsibility, to engage with the world around us, to hold our leaders accountable, and to demand better.
Yeah, I can see that. And that starts with staying informed, asking tough questions, and not being afraid to challenge the status quo.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about remembering that we're all connected. What happens in one part of the world affects us all, even if we don't see it right away.
It's easy to get caught up in our own little bubbles.
It is. But I think Nance is right when he says that each of us has a role to play in shaping the future. And that's a powerful message, I think. So on that note, we'll leave you with one final thought. If this post-war world order really is crumbling, what's going to replace it? And what role will you play in shaping that new world?
Lots to ponder there.
It is. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.